In 2001, Steve Ballmer, then Microsoft's CEO, sat down with the Chicago Sun-Times and described Linux as a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. At the Build 2026 Developer Conference in June of this year, the company Steve Ballmer led released its own Linux distribution to the public. Azure Linux 4.0 is a real open-source Linux distribution maintained entirely by Microsoft. It is derived from Fedora, runs on Azure virtual machines, and has already been powering Microsoft's own infrastructure for years, without most people knowing its existence. The irony of this is extraordinary enough to sit with for a moment. The company that called Linux a cancer now ships Linux. The CEO, whose contempt for open source was so vivid it became a famous tech industry quote, has been succeeded by an organization that maintains its own Linux kernel patches, employs hundreds of Linux engineers, contributes to the Linux kernel, and just released a Linux distribution that has been quietly running Microsoft's own production services for 5 years. But the question this video answers is not, is this ironic? Obviously, yes. The question is whether you, as a Windows user or a Linux user or someone deciding between them, should be worried about Microsoft releasing Azure Linux 4.0. And the honest answer requires understanding what Azure Linux actually is, what it is not, and what the fact of its existence tells us about Microsoft's real relationship with Linux in 2026. Azure Linux started in 2019 under the name CBL Mariner, short for Common Base Linux Mariner, as an internal Microsoft project to build a lightweight, secure OS for Azure's own infrastructure. By 2022, it was already powering production workloads at scale, including AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure SQL, and Azure Cosmos DB. LinkedIn migrated its entire infrastructure to Azure Linux 3, and Databricks moved more than 100,000 VMs and over 1 million CPU cores to it, with 0 customer-facing incidents. This is the part of the story that the headline, "Microsoft just released their own Linux," obscures. Microsoft did not just start working on Linux. Azure Linux has been running in production at massive scale for 5 years. LinkedIn, which Microsoft owns, runs on it. Databricks, one of the most significant enterprise data platform companies, moved 1 million CPU cores to it. This is not an experimental project or a strategic announcement with nothing behind it. It is a mature, production-hardened operating system that Microsoft has been depending on for its own cloud business. Azure Linux is the base container OS for Microsoft Azure Services and the graphical component of WSL2. Azure Linux is being developed by the Linux Systems Group at Microsoft for its edge network services and as part of its cloud infrastructure. The company uses it as the base Linux for containers in the Azure Stack HCI implementation of Azure Kubernetes Service. Version 4.0 is what changed at Build 2026. Microsoft now builds Azure Linux as a set of declarative overlays on top of a Fedora 43 snapshot, with every deviation from the upstream documented in the public GitHub repository. The move from maintaining every component from scratch, which versions 1 through 3 did, to building on a Fedora 43 snapshot is a significant architectural decision. It means Azure Linux is now a downstream of Fedora in the way that Ubuntu is a downstream of Debian. Fedora's upstream work on packages flows into Azure Linux, and Microsoft's engineers focus their effort on the specific overlays and customizations that make the distribution work well in Azure, rather than maintaining everything independently. Officially announced at the Open Source Summit North America on May 18, 2026, and launched into public preview at Build 2026 on June 2nd. Azure Linux 4.0 is now available on Azure VMs and VM scale sets, with AKS support and a WSL distribution coming shortly after. The most important thing to understand about Azure Linux 4.0 is what it is not. It is not a general-purpose distribution like Ubuntu or Fedora that you install on a laptop, set up a desktop, and use as your daily driver. There is no graphical interface, there is no audio stack, there is no desktop environment. The base image does not even ship with a pager like Less. It installs only what cloud and server workloads need, nothing more. This is the distinction that makes the "should you be worried" framing both understandable and misleading. Azure Linux is not a competitor to Zorin OS, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, or Windows 11. It is not targeting the Windows desktop market. It is not trying to put a Linux experience on your laptop. It is a server and container operating system, purpose-built for the cloud infrastructure that your applications run on when you host them in Azure. The comparison set for Azure Linux is not Ubuntu Desktop or Zorin OS. It is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Amazon Linux, and Google's Container-Optimized OS. These are the operating systems that cloud workloads run on, that data centers deploy, that Kubernetes clusters use as their node operating system. Azure Linux is competing with RHEL on Azure, not with Windows 11 on your laptop. Azure Linux 4.0 is entirely text-based, with no graphical setup wizard as you would find on Fedora or Ubuntu. Creating a user account is optional during setup and easy to miss, which would leave you unable to log in. If you tried to use Azure Linux 4.0 as a desktop replacement, you would be starting with a system that has no browser, no file manager, no application store, no desktop at all. You would need to install everything from scratch using the DNF5 package manager. This is appropriate for a server operating system and completely wrong for a desktop one. The question, should you be worried, really has two different audiences with two different concerns. For Linux desktop users, people using Zorin OS, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Fedora Workstation, Pop OS, or any consumer Linux distribution, Azure Linux 4.0 is not a competitive threat and does not represent any change to your daily computing experience. A Microsoft-maintained cloud server OS has no more relevance to your desktop Linux experience than Amazon's internal Linux distribution has to your desktop experience. You may not even know what operating system is running on the servers your web browser connects to, and Azure Linux joining that landscape does not change what your desktop OS does. For Linux server and enterprise administrators, people deploying workloads on Azure, evaluating operating systems for Kubernetes clusters, choosing a container-based image, Azure Linux 4.0 is a legitimate alternative to consider. The fact that it is Microsoft maintained and Azure optimized means it will have the best possible integration with Azure services. The Fedora 43 base means it uses familiar tooling for anyone with Fedora or RHEL experience. The free pricing removes a licensing cost that RHEL carries. The 5-year production track record behind it is genuine. The initial response from the cloud-native community has been cautiously optimistic. Developers accustomed to Fedora welcome the familiar environment, while enterprises appreciate the prospect of a free Microsoft-supported Linux distro that reduces licensing complexity. The concern that enterprise users have raised is legitimate. Microsoft's historical relationship with Linux has been adversarial for much of its history. The Halloweens, documents, the SEO funding, the Linux is a cancer era. Trusting Microsoft to be a responsible steward of a Linux distribution they control requires believing that the company's strategic position has changed enough to make that trust warranted. The counterargument, and it is a strong one, is that Azure Linux's business case aligns Microsoft's incentives with Linux's success. The public preview release reinforces the narrative that Microsoft sees Linux as a critical part of its cloud strategy, not a competing product. Microsoft's Azure revenue depends on Linux. More than 50% of Azure virtual machines already run Linux. If Azure Linux helps organizations migrate workloads to Azure and run them more efficiently, Microsoft profits. Microsoft's incentive is to make Azure Linux excellent because excellent Azure Linux means more Azure revenue. This is very different from the era when Microsoft's incentive was to suppress Linux because Linux competed with Windows desktop licensing. This is the question that the most historically aware members of the Linux community have been asking since Azure Linux's public release. The Halloween documents from 1998 describe Microsoft's strategy as embrace, extend, extinguish, adopt open standards, extend them with proprietary additions, use the proprietary additions to extinguish the open alternative. Is Azure Linux the embrace phase of a new cycle aimed at Linux? The honest answer requires separating the different parts of Microsoft's current Linux engagement. Azure Linux itself is genuinely open source. It is free and open source, and all deviations from the Fedora 43 upstream are documented publicly in the GitHub repository. The source is available. The patches are visible. The governance is public. This is not the behavior of embrace, extend, extinguish. It is the behavior of a company using open source appropriately and transparently. The concern worth naming is a different one: vendor lock-in through ecosystem integration. Azure Linux's deep integration with Azure services, its primary selling point, means that organizations that adopt Azure Linux, because it works best on Azure, become more dependent on Azure. Migrating off Azure when your infrastructure is built around Azure, specific tooling that Azure Linux is optimized for, is harder than migrating off Azure from a neutral operating system. This is not extinguish Linux. It is use Linux to increase Azure dependency. That is a different kind of strategic play, and it is one worth understanding before adopting Azure Linux because it is free. The Fedora dependency creates a second consideration. Some concerns have been raised about the longevity of Microsoft's commitment to Linux, given the company's historical ambivalence. Microsoft's commitment to Azure Linux is commercially motivated. If Azure's business model changes significantly, if Microsoft decides cloud computing is less central to its future, or if it decides to consolidate its cloud infrastructure onto different operating systems, the commercial rationale for maintaining Azure Linux changes. This is not an imminent risk, but it is a structural risk that Red Hat Enterprise Linux, with 30 years of institutional history, does not have. Azure Container Linux is Microsoft's second Linux product from Build 2026, and it is easy to confuse with Azure Linux 4.0 since they share the same kernel and security update schedule. The main difference is that Azure Container Linux is immutable. The OS ships as a read-only image, so you cannot install packages, change settings, or make any changes on a running system. When an update arrives, Windows swaps the entire image out for a new one, with an automatic rollback if something breaks. This is the more architecturally interesting product of the two, and it is almost always discussed as an afterthought to Azure Linux 4.0. Azure Container Linux is immutable, the same design philosophy as Fedora CoreOS, Flat-Car Container Linux, and in the Linux desktop space, Bazzite and other atomic image-based Linux distributions. The immutable approach has a specific and powerful advantage. It eliminates a whole class of security vulnerabilities. If the OS image is read-only, malware cannot modify system files. If an update introduces a problem, the rollback is automatic and complete. The entire image reverts, not just the changed packages. The system state is always defined by the image, rather than by the accumulated history of package installations and configuration changes. This design is not new. It is the same principle used in Chrome OS, Android updates, and container orchestration systems. But Microsoft shipping it as an Azure product represents a vote of confidence in the immutable OS model that is interesting in the context of Windows direction. The Windows K2 Quality Initiative has been working on reducing update-induced failures. The immutable approach solves this problem at an architectural level rather than an engineering level. A future Windows, built on immutable system images, would be fundamentally more reliable for updates. Not because Microsoft tests patches better, but because rollback is structural rather than optional. 25 years ago, Microsoft's CEO Steve Ballmer called Linux a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. At Build 2026 in June, the same company shipped its own Linux distribution to the public. The simplest true statement about Microsoft and Linux in 2026 is this: Microsoft needs Linux, not in the way that Linux advocates hoped Microsoft would need it, not as a desktop OS replacement that Windows users would migrate to. In a more commercially immediate way, Microsoft's most profitable product line, Azure, runs predominantly on Linux. The AI training clusters, the Kubernetes workloads, the container infrastructure, the edge computing deployments, all of it runs on Linux, increasingly on Microsoft's own Linux. Microsoft's relationship with Linux has not become friendly. It has become financially necessary. Where the company that called Linux a cancer discovered that it needed to grow and tend that cancer because the cancer was growing its cloud business. Azure Linux 4.0 is the most visible expression of that necessity. It is not a threat to consumer Linux. It is not a trap for desktop Linux users. It is a cloud operating system built by a company whose business requires Linux to succeed in the cloud, wrapped in enough open source transparency to be genuinely useful to the developers and enterprises who are also building on that cloud. Should you be worried? If you are a desktop Linux user, no. If you are a developer deploying workloads on Azure, you should evaluate it on its technical merits. Genuinely good for Azure-optimized cloud workloads, genuinely problematic if you prioritize vendor independence. If you are someone watching what Microsoft's behavior says about the future of Linux as a platform, this is the clearest data point yet that the era of Microsoft trying to suppress Linux is over, and the era of Microsoft depending on Linux has arrived. Whether that dependency makes Linux stronger or more controlled by a large commercial interest is the question that the next decade of the Microsoft-Linux relationship will answer.